Ascent Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Thriving in a Male-Dominated Workplace by Harvard Business Review. Narrated by Stephanie Dillard, with Amanda Kersey, Leah Sheppard, Teresa Cardador, Julia González Romero, Cristina Massa, Stacey Abrams, Lara Hodgson, Raven Hoffman, and Vanessa Bohns.
Introduction. Fighting the Disparities. By me, Amanda Kersey, producer of Women at Work. Toward the end of 2019, Women at Work co-host Amy Gallo and I visited Olin College of Engineering in Massachusetts. Olin's student body is slightly over half female, which is an extraordinary gender ratio for an engineering program. We were there to hear from two seniors, Anna and Elena, who would soon enter a workforce that was far less equal and far more inhospitable. We wanted to ask them what sort of support they had gotten in school that they hoped to receive in their jobs, and how they envisioned their futures. Having read up on the career outlook for women in STEM fields, I wondered whether Anna and Elena understood the extent of the challenges awaiting them, whether they had started to develop the skills to deal and a plan to succeed. Elena told us she'd come to view the women on Olin's faculty as role models. She said, "It's amazing to see them come in and teach class every day and know that I could go do that." Finding the same level of gender representation, she added, would also be a big thing when I'm looking at places to work. Given that 8.7% of mechanical engineers in the United States are women, and that the aerospace industry, which she hoped to join, has been stuck at around 20% globally for the last 30 years, finding a company that met her expectations likely would be difficult. Interning taught her that she'd need to vet companies not only for how many women they employed, but also hidden stressors within the culture. During one internship, a female employee had complained to her about how the men regularly got coffee together without ever inviting the women. From that point on, Elena noticed as well. She said, "This isn't something that everyone sees immediately. When I think about places that I'm going to work long term, how do I notice these dynamics before I say yes?" Anna, meanwhile, was preparing to join the 1.7% of mechanical engineers in the United States who are Asian women. She said, "I think about being in a predominantly white space and how that also makes it difficult in some cases to speak up. The reticence that can result from feeling a heightened sense of difference is one of the harmful effects of environments being segregated by sex and race." Unfortunately, Elena's experience isn't unique, and Anna's concerns aren't unfounded. Women in male-dominated fields and workplaces who already face exclusion and isolation must deal with stereotypes that compound the stress. For instance, men in these spaces often assume that women, especially non-white women, aren't sufficiently competent, even if they're highly educated and skilled. Women put in extra effort to strive for perfection, fit into uncomfortable norms, and prove themselves as valuable team members. Yet they struggle to gain the respect they deserve, get credit for their work, and attain leadership opportunities. An email our podcast team received from a mid-career engineer speaks to the frustration we've heard from many women. She wrote, "To get to where I am in my career today, I've spent a huge amount of time and energy pushing for more responsibility, agonizing over how to act in situations, exceeding expectations on tasks, and fighting for recognition. At the same time, I feel like the men around me just have to do normal things and produce normal work to get the big projects, the boss's trust, and the big promotions." Women regularly fight against these unfair practices so that they can accomplish the technical, essential projects that they aspire to, and that their companies hire them to do. But for all the ways that male-dominated workplaces undermine them, many still want to be there and intend to stay. And despite the frustration, they have resolve. In 2021, I listened to a webinar for women in construction. They were discussing the progress they'd made in an industry where their representation is approximately 13% in Canada and 10% in the US and the EU. One of the panelists summed up their resourcefulness. "Ladies," she said, "this is construction. Sometimes we won't have a seat at the table, but bring your folding chair." This book is for both women sitting in a folding chair and those at the table. For those in a folding chair, the book offers facts and validation about the challenges women face, an argument for seeing yourself as an asset, not an impostor, and advice for building a strong reputation, identifying allies, and responding to bias. It also has answers to questions that our listeners, whether they work in sales, software, or national security, have asked over and over. Like, how can I improve my experiences at work, be seen and valued, progress in my career? While specific cultures, both geographic and corporate, have a significant influence on each woman's experiences, this book highlights some of the universal challenges women in male-dominated workplaces face and provides solutions. Through research, conversations with experts, and detailed personal accounts, it explains why these systems persist and how industries and organizations need to change. Most of all, it has tips and advice to help you thrive until that happens. But you can't do it alone, nor should you try. As one of our listeners who for 17 years has been the only woman in a small department of a large utility company wrote to us, it's very isolating because there's no one in this section of the company that I can commiserate with or band together with. So I am all on my lonesome to call things out and try to change them. This book will equip you to connect with the few women around you, as well as with the men and leaders who can play a part in your growth and development. You'll also learn to navigate some particularly uncomfortable experiences, including overt bias and sexism. While many companies are tamping down on such attitudes and behaviors, they're still a widespread problem. One of our listeners, a woman in the mining industry, recounted a meeting where she was standing next to a female colleague who was preparing to speak. As she reviewed her talking points on a notepad, which included a to-do list, a male colleague reached over and added "bake a cake" to the list. And another woman, a sales executive in construction, told us, quote, "Going out for drinks, I hear the men talking about other women in the bar. I don't know how to respond to the constant sarcasm. After all, it always has more than a little truth to it. You'll learn when and how to speak up in these situations, even if that inappropriate comment is coming from your boss." While all of the advice is intended to help you as an individual, researcher Teresa Cardador emphasizes at the start of the book that, quote, "the onus really needs to be on organizations to change their cultures, change the reward systems that they have, or change how they value and reward men over women in these kinds of environments." For that reason, in the last section of the book, we call on everyone sitting at the table to build a better culture with those around them. Men and women alike must come together to break up overly masculine cultures, pay attention to the discrimination and harassment happening to women, especially those who are not white, and enact real change. Since our podcast launched, many women have written in to say that our conversations have not only validated their experiences, but have also given them courage and hope. Many times the positive impact that women say our podcast has had on their lives has left me crying at my computer. One woman in a deeply sex-segregated field and workplace told us that for years she'd been sexually harassed and had been scared to speak up. She wrote, "Your podcast gave me a lot of courage, and finally I told the sexual harassment committee about the issues. Things are starting to change. You told us that we need to change our cultures. I think my action is a small but solid step to change our culture in our fields. We hope this book will help you do the same."
Section 1. The Challenges We Face. 1. Subtle Stressors That Hold Us Back. A conversation with Teresa Cardador. It can be difficult when you work in a field or workplace where men significantly outnumber women. Gender bias can run rampant. You can feel like an outsider on your team. You may feel like you have no control over your career path or growth. It takes resilience just to survive, let alone thrive. Teresa Cardador, a professor at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, has documented the stress female engineers commonly feel from working with mostly men, as well as how they cope. In this conversation, Amy Bernstein, Amy Gallo, and Nicole Torres, co-hosts of HBR's Women at Work podcast, talk to Teresa about the subtle stressors facing women in male-dominated workplaces and how to overcome them.
We've heard from students of engineering about the stressors affecting women preparing for a career in this field. What stands out to you as the major challenges that women need to overcome when you hear accounts like these?
So the first one that stood out to me is some references to what seemed to be more subtle stressors related to sort of this feeling of minority or outsider status in a profession that seems to be kind of reserved for men. So men thinking of themselves as already part of the club, and that women kind of starting out feeling like outsiders and having to work their way in. And this is hard to do, right? This feels hard to do at times. And so some of the things that came up that other women that I've talked to have referenced quite a bit are things like it being a little bit harder to speak up. You feel like you're not being listened to. You might feel excluded. Definitely feelings of having to prove yourself. And even questioning yourself, this idea of, do I really belong here? Because you feel like you're outside of the club. So dealing with these kinds of subtle stressors is effortful, and it can often be draining for people.
So what about the confidence gap?
Yeah, so the confidence gap is really complicated, I think. So I think it gets back to this issue that I was talking about, which is that as a result of their, perceived outsider status in this profession, women, they often assume that men know more than they do. Men often in these kind of more masculine, competitive, kind of bro culture environments may speak more confidently. Women tend to learn over time that this confident speaking as a signal for knowing more isn't necessarily the case. So they might learn over time that they do know as much as the guys do, but it lowers their confidence in the short run.
So of the women that you've studied, how do you find that they deal with these stressors?
So in my research, we have uncovered what we consider to be another subtle stressor. So maybe I can talk about that a little bit first, and then I'll talk about how women address these issues. So in some of the research that I've been doing lately, we found that the roles that women perform in engineering can often seem less valued within the profession as compared to the roles that men play. So everyone is familiar with the idea that engineering is a sex-segregated occupation, right? There's this idea it's more men than women. But in the research that myself and my colleagues have been doing recently, we've noticed some patterns of sex segregation within the occupation itself. In engineering, there are two kind of recognized sets of skills that people talk about. One is sort of the one that you think about generally, which is the hard, in quotes, hard technical skills. And then on the other side is the sort of soft, or what are often referred to as professional skills or managerial skills. And the former are often more valued in engineering and associated with sort of what it means to be a real engineer, whereas the latter, the more professional or soft skills, if you will, which, as I said, involve things like managing, maybe communicating, multitasking, being the one who manages the engineering team or is the engineering manager. Those kinds of skills tend to be viewed by engineers as more peripheral and less associated with what it means to be a real engineer. And so what my research shows, and research of others has shown, is that women, as I said, are disproportionately likely to pursue roles in the sort of purely technical side and are more likely to be found in these more professional skill requirements. And now, to be clear, these professional skill requirement roles within engineering are very highly technical still, but because of the way that the more technical roles tend to be more valued in engineering and more associated with what it means to be a real engineer, the roles that women play, these more, in quotes, peripheral roles, tend to leave them feeling like their roles are less valued, often less respected, and those kinds of things create stress. The other thing that I want to make clear is that my research doesn't show that as a result of women moving into these managerial roles, they're more likely to have access to top-level management roles in organizations, in engineering organizations. Those are still dominated by men, unfortunately. So it's not giving them the fast track to high-level managerial positions. Yeah. It tends to be more of these kind of product management, project management, managerial engineering type positions. And there can be a real bump in terms of pay associated with moving into a managerial role. But what my research shows, and I have a study along with Patrick Hill that shows some of these outcomes as well, that women who move into these managerial roles versus the technical roles report things like lower perceptions that their work is meaningful, lower identification with their engineering colleagues, right? Maybe for some of the reasons that I talked about. Mm-hmm. They report greater work-life balance challenges, and this could be because the managerial roles allow for a little bit less flexibility in where they spend their time and how they spend it. Maybe require a little bit more face time, that sort of thing. They report greater intention to leave the profession, and they generally get judged more harshly on their technical ability. And so in an environment where women are already stereotyped as less technically competent, being disproportionately present in this role, we think that it reinforces gender stereotypes about their technical ability and their competence in the eyes of their male colleagues.
And you're not seeing that kind of negative piece of it with men who advance into managerial roles?
Oh, that's a really good question. So we haven't really studied the experience of men in managerial roles specifically, but I can tell you what some of the interview data were telling us from the study. And the short answer is that men do not seem to be as penalized in terms of perceptions of their technical ability and technical competence. So in men, it appears to be this kind of both and perception that they have the technical ability as well as these more broad professional skills. But for women, there seems to be more of a perception that one comes at the cost of the other, if that makes sense.
So women move into those roles because they don't have the technical chops.
Exactly.
Whereas if men do it, it's because they have these great additional managerial skills they can add to the mix.
Right.
Yeah. So you do study how women deal with a lot of these stressors, whether it's being pushed into managerial jobs, feeling less confident, the overt bias or the microaggressions. What do you see women who are succeeding in these fields do differently?
Well, so there's maybe a few things that I can mention. The first thing that I think is really important for women is to understand the nature of the sort of gender stereotypes and biases that they're confronting in this particular environment. So I think a lot of women who enter the profession think there's this sense that, you know, these kinds of stereotypes and bias are maybe things that their parents experienced or their mom experienced, but it's not something that affects them. And so I think many women are surprised and dismayed to see that especially as they progress in the profession, that these things still go on, that they will experience overt forms of discrimination and more subtle forms of bias. Some of my work on the managerial role side, in terms of women going into managerial roles, one of the things that I often mention when I talk to women about this particular issue is really to try to evaluate your own personal preferences as you consider what roles you want to take within engineering. So some of the women that I've talked to in my research actually say, you know, yes, I'm very interested in pursuing a managerial role because it fits with my perceptions, it fits with the way that I like to do work, it fits with my interests. And other women that I talk to tell me that they definitely started out on a more technical track, but over time they were mentored by, very well-meaning mentors and organizations into more managerial roles because they were identified as having skills that might be seen as relatively rare in those contexts. The very good communication skills, very good skills in terms of organizing other people that maybe their male colleagues were not seen as being as strong in those areas. And so they say that they sort of are mentored into these more managerial type roles, and then they kind of get on a path where those managerial experiences become path dependent. And so, they actually report that the organization is kind of grooming them to take on those kinds of roles. So one thing I when I talk to women about managerial versus technical, I often, just encourage them to think about whether the paths that they're being mentored into are actually a good fit with their preferences, or are they, sort of choosing these roles because someone in their organization is encouraging them in this direction, even if it maybe isn't something that naturally fits their interests. And one thing that can be really difficult if you're on the managerial path for quite a long period of time is it can be a little bit difficult to get back on the technical path because the skills in those areas are so specialized. So if you're on the managerial role for a longer period of time, it might be easy or not surprising if people lose a little bit of their technical specialization. And it's not to say that you can't get that back, of course, but because of the role requirements, a lot of my engineers report to me that you don't have to have as much technical specialization to pursue the managerial roles.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like the advice, given what you've just described, for women who feel like they're being put in that path is to decide quickly whether they want that or not. And if they do, to even, set it up as an experiment so that the transition back won't be so painful or so difficult if they decide that's what they want to do.
Yeah. And there are definitely women in my samples who remained on the technical track. And what some of them said, consistent with what you're talking about, Amy, is that they were very strategic in wanting to remain on, even if they had managerial aspirations later, they were very strategic in wanting to stay on the technical career path for a minimum number of years in order to sort of ensure that they had retained or developed the technical chops to just make sure that they would be maximally prepared to have that flexibility later on. So they didn't necessarily talk about it as a strategy to protect themselves from being stuck in a particular role later on, but they just felt like they needed to have a certain level of technical sophistication before they thought about moving into a managerial role.
One of the tactics that the students talked about was playing nice in order to get things done.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, have you seen that in your research, and how has that worked for women that you've looked at?
Yeah, so this is a classic thing that I hear all the time. And so the upside is this potential for connection, right? So they were talking about how they really enjoy interacting with people in the workplace in a, relational way. But that the downside of having to do this sort of work is that it's a form of emotional labor. It's very effortful, and it can be time consuming. I'm doing some research with some colleagues right now that's in progress that shows how women, we refer to it as performative niceness, which is how they are required to engage in a certain set of behaviors that are very time consuming, that literally add hours to their day, having to engage in these types of behaviors. And so it's effortful, it can be time consuming. And then over the long run, another important implication is that it can undermine your authority if you're being seen as too nice. And so this double edge this fine line, if you will, that a lot of women, and this is particularly women in male-dominated occupations, because the gender stereotypes are so exaggerated in sex-typed occupations, they have to sort of thread the needle, if you will, or walk this fine line where you have to play nice in order to avoid penalty and get what you want, but it can sometimes undermine your authority. Yeah. And so the mixture of the two is really needed.
You said you related to this needing to thread the needle, and I'm curious, what are your tactics?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's hard. It's definitely something that I've experienced in my own career. So let me try to say something optimistic or positive here. So I think So I think some of the research that I'm doing right now and some of the work that's out there shows that it gets better with advancing tenure. So I think that's one thing. And I think with advanced tenure, many women feel that they have proved their competence and they have to engage in less of these sort of proving behaviors. And so I think it does get better with advancing tenure, and we're definitely finding that in the research that I'm doing now. And then the other factor is that I think it gets better, or it's less of a challenge for women when they have established relationships. which is correlated with tenure, of course. But I think as a result of, those two factors, you maybe have to, engage in these sort of proving behaviors a little bit less. And then also in established relationships, you might get more of a pass for, not being nice all the time, right? So if people know you, if they work with you all the time in the operating room versus, are one of many teams that rotate through with a team of surgeons in the operating room. If they know you and they've worked with you day in and day out, if you have a bad day or you're super directive with someone or you raise your voice even, you show those kinds of assertive behaviors that might be penalized in other contexts, people might be more willing to give you a pass because they're like, we know Teresa, she's a real person and she's just having a bad day, right? So once you form relationships with people, it tends to possibly get a little bit easier.
Well, if you are in an organization and you're starting to feel like you don't fit in and you're thinking about leaving, or trying to make it work, what do you suggest that women do? Do they just quit or can they try to make it better for themselves?
So I get asked for career advice a lot, and I'm really always super hesitant to give career advice to other people because there's so many factors that go into play in terms of, somebody making a decision about what's right for them. I think if the situation is really not sustainable, and they're really miserable and unhappy in a situation, then I would really encourage women to try to look for environments where they can feel that they're equally valued and that they are maximally supported and that those environments are friendly to women and also to men. So I think that if they really felt like the environment that they were in wasn't sustainable, I might encourage that, or I might ask a series of questions to help them understand whether making a move was right for them. I think that a lot of the solutions that we try to think of in terms of, how should women navigate the situation? What should they do? And really put the onus on women to change their behavior, change their environment, figure out how to talk to people differently or how to change their attitude in some way. And none of those recommendations feel satisfying to me because I feel it's not that having the awareness and doing some behavioral change or even some attitudinal change isn't important. It can be helpful in terms of general coping. But for these kinds of issues to change really truly and for women to benefit, I think, maximally, the onus really needs to be on organizations to change their cultures and change the reward systems that they have or change how they value and reward men over women in these kinds of environments. And so without changing, I think without focusing on those broader cultural and systemic issues, it just, I think that's where we're going to make the most change. And so that's why I'm dancing around the recommendation a little bit because I tend to think that the changes required are a little bit broader.
2. To succeed, women need more visibility. By Shelley J. Correll and Lori Nishiura Mackenzie. Companies in male-dominated industries are failing to retain their female employees. A study by Jennifer Glass of the University of Texas at Austin and her co-authors found that women leave STEM fields at dramatically higher rates than women in other occupations. After 12 years, 50% of women in technical industries, predominantly engineering and computer science, had switched to other fields. 20% of other women professionals had done the same. The highest profile losses in tech are those at the senior level. These women often are less satisfied with their careers, perceive that they are unlikely to advance at their current organizations, or believe they must change jobs in order to reach the next level. As one technology executive explained to us, we have some very capable women in the middle management and junior VP levels, but they leave our firm to advance their careers as they continually get passed over for promotion. What can companies do to stop the departure of senior women? One critical but overlooked strategy: make sure that women have the right kind of visibility within the organization. We led a thought exercise for 240 senior leaders of a Silicon Valley technology company asking them to identify the most critical factors for success at their level. The group agreed on track record and skills-based factors, a history of delivering results, a technical depth of expertise, and the ability to manage a technical team. Next, we asked them to name the most critical factors for promotion to their level. A new top criterion emerged,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?